Tonight, we're reading the second chapter of On the Edge of the Dark Sea of Darkness by Andrew Peterson. This is really for our family. If you happen to find this, join us for this on a weekly basis, we hope. Chapter 2, Nuggets, Hammers, and Potatoes. In the morning, the dreams were gone. The sun was shining, the cool of morning was losing ground to a hot summer sun, and Janner was imagining that he could fly. He was watching the dragonflies float across the pasture, putting his mind into a dragonfly's mind to see what it saw and feel what it felt. He imagined the slight turn of a wing that sent it zipping across a meadow, whipping left and right, lifting on the wind up over the treetops or scaling down the craggy drop to the dark sea. He imagined that if he were a dragonfly, he would smile while he flew, though he wasn't sure that dragonflies could smile, because he wouldn't have to worry about the ground tripping him up. It seemed to Janner that in the last few months he had lost control of his limbs. His fingers were longer, his feet were bigger, and his mother had recently said that he was all elbows and knees. Janner reached into his pocket and, looking around to be sure no one was watching, pulled out a folded piece of old paper. His stomach fluttered as it had when he found the paper the week before while sweeping his mother's bedroom. He unfolded it now to brood upon a sketch of a boy standing at the prow of a small sailboat. The boy had dark hair and gangly limbs and looked undeniably like Janner. Big billowy clouds whitened the sky, and the spray of the waves burst up in splashes that looked so real and wet that it seemed to Janner that if he could touch them, he would smear the picture. Beneath the drawings was written, "My 12th birthday, 2 hours alone on the open sea, and the best day of my life so far." There was no name on the picture, but Janner knew in his heart that the boy was his father. No one ever talked of his father, not his mother or his grandfather. Janner knew little about him, but seeing this picture was like opening a window on a dark place deep inside. It confirmed his suspicion that there was more to life than living and dying in Glipwood Township. Janner had never even seen a boat up close. He had watched them from the cliffs, specks cutting slow paths like ribbons through the distant waves, sailed by a crew on some adventurous errand or other. He imagined himself on his own ship, feeling the wind and the spray like the boy in the picture. Janner snapped out of his daydream to find himself leaning on a pitchfork up to his knees in itchy hay. Instead of feeling the ocean wind, he faced a cloud of chaff and dust shaken by Danny the cart horse, impatiently harnessed to a wagon half full of hay, waiting to be carried across the field to the barn. Janner had been working since sunrise and had made 3 trips already, anxious to finish his chores. Today was Dragon Day Festival, and the only day of the year that Janner was glad to be in the quiet town of Glipwood. The whole village waited all year for Dragon Day, when all of Scree seemed to descend on Glipwood. There would be games and food, strange-looking people from faraway cities, and the dragons themselves rising up out of the dark sea of darkness. As far as he knew, Janner had never left Glipwood in all his 12 years, so the festival was the closest he got to seeing the rest of the world, and a good reason to be quick about finishing up with the hay. He wiped sweat from his forehead and looked wistfully over his shoulder at a dragonfly zipping away. Then he dug into the straw with a grunt and pitched it into the wagon. As he did so, his foot caught on a stone hidden beneath the hay, and he lurched forward, toppling face first into a neat, fresh pile of Danny the cart horse's nuggets. Janner leapt to his feet, sputtering and wiping his face with fistfuls of hay. Danny the cart horse looked at him, snorted, and tore up a mouthful of grass, while Janner ran, quick as the dragonfly, to the water trough to clean his face. Across the field and past the fence, Janner's brother Tink, whose given name was Kalmar, straddled the cottage roof, 2 nails between his lips and a hammer in one hand. Tink was trying to repair a loose shingle, but having a hard time of it, so violent was his trembling. When he was younger, just riding on his grandfather's shoulders made him nervous, and though he laughed, his eyes were always wide with fear until he was placed firmly on the ground again. Podo, his grandfather, always assigned the reparation of the roof to Tink because he thought it would do him good to face his fear, but Tink, now 11 years old, was still as frightened as ever. Shaking like a leaf, he removed a nail from between his lips and hammered it into the roof as timidly as if he were hammering his own face. He looked out across the field to see Janner trip headlong into the water trough, and he wished he were finished with his chores so he could play a game of Zizby, with his big brother at the Dragon Day Games. Now, Zisby, this is a little note here in the bottom of the page, Zisby gained wide popularity in Scree in the year 356, a lawn game played with giant darts hurled high into the air by the offensive team, a whacker, a flat board with a handle, and 3 rocks. Injuries abounded, however, and because of the public outcry, the game was banned. In 372, that's 16 years later, it was discovered that a passable version of the game could be played by replacing the giant darts with brooms. For complete rules and a deeper look into Zisby's fascinating and bloody history, see We Played, We Bled, We Swept by Vince Trisbeck, Three Forks Publishing, Valberg, 3 of 423. All right, continuing with the story. Tink was useless on the roof, but when his feet were on the solid ground, he could run like a stag. With the first tap of the hammer, the nail slipped between Tink's fingers. He tried to catch it, missed, and threw himself down, hugging both sides of the hot roof. Nail and hammer clattered down the roof in opposite directions and over the edge. Tink groaned because it meant having to inch his way over the edge and down the ladder again. It also meant that it would be that much longer before they were able to go into town for the festival. Lose something? Tink's fear turned to grumpiness. Just throw it back up, will you? Tink heard laughter, then the hammer flew up, end over end, and landed a few feet from him. He gathered his courage to reach near the edge and grabbed the hammer with a trembling hand just before it slid back down. Thanks, Lily, he called, trying to sound a lot nicer. Lily sat back down on the steps at the back of the cottage and continued peeling potatoes, humming to herself. Nugget was at her feet, tail wagging, panting in the welcome shade. Soon Lily worked her way to her feet with a small wooden crutch and brushed the potato peelings from the front of her dress. Carrying a bucket, she limped into the house, Nugget close behind. Her right leg twisted inward at an unnatural angle below the knee, and the toes of her bad leg trailed lightly along the wooden floor. When she was little more than a baby, she had learned to walk with a tiny crutch under her arm, and every year her grandfather made her a bigger one, each more ornate and sturdy than the last. This one was made of yew and had little purple flowers etched along its length. Lily plopped the bucket of peeled potatoes onto the table behind Nia, her mother, who was tossing ingredients into a large pot of stew. Ah, thank you, dear. Nia wiped her hands upon her apron, then pushed a few stray hairs behind her ears. She was tall and graceful, and Lily thought her mother was so beautiful that the plain dress she wore fit her like a royal gown. Nia's hands were strong and calloused from years of hard work, but gentle enough to braid Lily's hair or to stroke her boys' faces when she kissed them goodnight. Would you fetch your grandfather for me? She asked. He's been in the garden gathering herbs for at least an hour now, which can only mean one thing. Lily laughed. The thwaps are back. I'm afraid so. Nia turned back to her stew just as another clatter sounded above them. Her eyes followed the sound across the ceiling to the window where she and Lily saw Tink's hammer fall to the grass. A muffled moan came from the roof. I'll get it. Lily limped out the back door and tossed the hammer back up to Tink. Janner loped up to the cottage, sopping wet from the waist up, bringing with him a terrible smell and a swarm of fat green flies buzzing about his head. As Lily limped around to the front of the cottage to find her grandfather, she heard her mother shriek and shoo Janner out of the house, where he was promptly bonked on the head by a falling hammer. Shall I continue with chapter 3? I've got 1 no, 2 no's. All right, we'll continue chapter 3 on another date. Thank you for joining.